about rebuilding. And with us again is Jerry Hauer, who's had time for us before, in part because while Jerry Hauer set up the Office of Emergency Management in New York City, it's gone physically, and you now have time for us, and we're very grateful for that. As you talk to your colleagues in the community, in the business community and the city community, among contractors, among the people trying to get the city back to something, how's it going?
I think it's going very, very well, Peter. First of all, the mayor's done an incredible job. The rescue workers that are out there in horrible weather have done just magnificent work. It's very tedious work. They're getting enormous support from the private sector, cranes, crane operators, dump trucks. Everybody is pulling together. I drove down there yesterday with Secretary Thompson as we toured the site, and there were easily 1,000 people lined up along the streets applauding as workers went through. The city is pulled together, the nation is pulled together, and things have gone smoothly considering the magnitude of this disaster.
One of the things that struck me down there this morning was that there appears to be an absence of non-professional volunteers, by which I mean there are still volunteer firefighters there from all over the country, as you pointed out. The construction industry, the construction equipment industry is participating, but it seems to be very, very precisely organized at the moment.
It is. Well, the city has incredible resources. The people organizing the operation, the fire commissioner, the police commissioner, Richie Shearer, the director of the mayor's office of emergency management, have got this thing working very smoothly. Again, considering the magnitude of the disaster, it has been orchestrated exceptionally well. And the problem is it's just going to be a slow, tedious process, and it's going to take a considerable amount of time to do the recovery effort.
Okay. Stay with us, if you would, because we've been joined by 3 other people to talk about rebuilding. I know it's difficult to talk about rebuilding while the nation is still focused on the search for survivors in the rubble, but I think everybody from the president on down thinks that rebuilding and the discussion and the urge to rebuild is particularly good for the national psyche. And so let's continue. We're joined by Bruce Mosler, who is the president of U.S. operations of Cushman and Wakefield, which is the largest integrated real estate company in the world. Excuse me. By Ken Lewis, who is the chairman and CEO of the Bank of America. Bank of America was the 6th largest tenant at the World Trade Center. And by Joseph Rose, who is the director of the New York Department of City Planning. Let me start with you, Mr. Rose, because you were there. First of all, thank you all very much for giving us the time. I just know how busy you all are at the moment. And Mr. Rose, just tell us how you think it's going.
Well, there is an amazing mobilization at the city, state, and federal level to deal with this crisis. We are determined, the mayor, the governor, the president are determined that this catastrophic attack not be allowed to cripple us, and that we emerge from this united and stronger than we were even at the outset.
I think everybody appreciates the determination. How's it going?
Well, it's going well. I just came back actually from being downtown, and the financial district is clean. It's being run-throughs are going on now to figure out how to bring the stock exchange back as quickly as possible. It'll be open Monday morning. We're coordinating with businesses to get people back down. We've been trying to keep people out for the last few days to focus on the rescue and recovery exercise, but we are extremely happy with how quickly we're able to bring back the financial district.
And what does it mean to run through things with the New York Stock Exchange at the moment?
Well, there are issues of power, telecommunications, access, how people are going to get down, how to do it, coordinate it in such a way that the transit systems work without at the same time impeding the rescue and recovery operation that's going on. So it's a tight space. There's a lot of activity going on down there, but it's important to us that we get everything back up and running as quickly as possible, and it's going quite well.
Is my impression from early this morning correct that you've got mostly The volunteers are pretty much out of the operation at the moment, and what you have now is a truly professional operation, because that's what you need.
Extremely professional operation with people who are trained in terms of what to do and operate according to a very rigorous chain of command, so that's a clear set of instructions, and that we're able to coordinate effectively what's going on down there.
Are you concerned about any other buildings down there at the moment? Are there any which are unstable to the point of being of concern to public safety?
No, there's been an extensive detailed structural analysis of all the adjoining buildings. City engineers have been detailed inspections of all the foundations, and the fact is the surrounding buildings are all in structurally good shape. There's clearly some facade issues and fears about falling glass and some issues on the facades, but the buildings structurally are sound, and we expect they'll be able to be reoccupied soon after the recovery work is completed.
So there's no other building in New York City, as far as you're concerned, that is going to collapse?
No, and we've the MTA has been running subways through the tunnels to check to make sure all the vibrations issues are addressed, and we're comfortable that that's all been satisfactorily addressed to make sure everything is secure.
When do you think you'll get the New York subway up and fully running?
Well, there are some tunnels that are still on a couple of lines that will go right through the site of the attack that are problematic, but we expect that the subway will be up and running in the next few days.
Are you concerned that New York City might, it's not meant to sound as crass as it probably sounds, but are you concerned that New York City might now lose business because while so many businesses are in search of of quarters at the moment, they may be tempted to move out of the city? Businesses come to this city and businesses go from the city depending on a lot of factors.
Well, the fact is that happens all the time. Our scramble, we've been looking for, working for several years on how to expand the universe of office space, first-class commercial space in the city of New York, because we're at a peak both in terms of population and employment and jobs. We're very comforted that several million square feet, and I think Bruce can speak to that as well, have already in the last few days been absorbed long-term commitments. People are extremely interested, and we're working very closely and reaching out to all the businesses that have been affected by this tragedy to make sure that they're accommodating.
My apologies. So what does it mean at the moment, though, that more than 20 million square feet of office space in New York City are suddenly missing?
Well, it means that we need very quickly to find, these are a lot of very complex operations that need to do business immediately, and whether it's in New York City and in surrounding areas, we need to find them office space. They are finding office space. The private sector, the New York City business community, and the partnership, the real estate board, and city and state government are working very closely to identify available space to move people into, obviously at the same time as the paramount issue of the rescue and the human tragedy here is addressed. We're also looking to identify how we can very quickly mobilize to rebuild, obviously first that approximately 15 million square feet of space that was lost, but also bring on more space, improve our infrastructure, and emerge from this attack showing clearly that if you strike at us, we will build back, and we will have even more at the end of the day than we started out with.
Okay, well, you've actually moved me to a subject. I'm going to turn to Mr. Mosler in just a second, but let me ask you your opinion first of all on this. You moved us to rebuilding quicker than I'd anticipated. The New York developer who holds the now 99-year lease on the World Trade Center, Larry Silverstein, says he is determined to rebuild the towers. Do you think that's realistic?
Well, I can't speak to the particular issue of this site. There's going to be a lot of thinking and a lot of planning that has to go on before we make those kind of determinations. And I know the mayor and the governor and the federal government are determined to rebuild. What we will do, and in conjunction with the owner of this property and many other owners, is rebuild major office buildings. We have many new major landmark office buildings under construction as we speak. Bear Stearns is about to move into a new building. We have the Columbus Center to the Time Warner headquarters going up at Columbus Circle. We will build major new skyscrapers, major new towers that are the symbols of New York City, and we will do so very quickly.
Okay, quickly or not, it's a long-term proposition. Let me now turn to Bruce Mosler, who is the president of for U.S. operations of Cushman and Wakefield, which is the largest integrated real estate company in the world. And among other things, I know you were an advisor both to J.P. Morgan and to the Port Authority on the sale of the World Trade Center last year. What's your appraisal of the current situation of New York City?
Well, good afternoon, Peter. I think what we have seen, and we're working with many tenants who are looking for homes at the moment, both permanent and temporary, what we've seen is a tremendous resolve amongst the tenants in the city to get back to business as usual and to stay in Manhattan as best we can guess at this moment. And remember, all these figures are approximate. We think that almost 3 million square feet of space has been committed to since this crisis on a long-term basis to New York.
What does that mean?
What that means is that the notion that these firms are looking for space outside of New York or have other concerns is really not true. They're committed to coming back and doing business in New York City proper.
Of all of the destruction and all of the suffering in terms of space, I'm not talking employees here, but of all the destruction in terms of space, which company suffered the most?
Peter, I probably am not the right person to ask of that question. We just know so many suffered so extensively, and our thoughts and prayers go out to them, particularly in the World Trade Center.
So what is happening at the moment now? I mean, you've suddenly got so many people displaced. I'm talking physically now. So many people displaced, so many businesses displaced. What do? Where do they go?
Well, they turn to people like the Real Estate Board of New York, to the city, and to firms like ours to find alternatives. And just to put some perspective on this for you, there's approximately 28 to 30 million square feet available between downtown, Midtown South, and the rest of New York.
That is after the destruction.
That is after the destruction, that's correct. So, you know, we're working with them to house them, both temporarily and permanently.
Everybody charging fair prices at the moment?
That's a terrific question, Peter. And the answer is that I think you'll see New Yorkers, both on the landlord side and the tenant side, committed to seeing that there's no price gouging and taking advantage of this. We've seen the exact opposite, as a matter of fact.
You're going to sit on people if they decide to gouge, right?
I think that's correct.
In fact, the Real Estate Board, if I can just interject, is sending out a letter today expecting, especially for the short-term space, that brokerages will forego commissions and that rents will be space will be offered at the same terms that it was before this catastrophe.
Yeah, I'm also aware, Mr. Rose, that price control, rent control, and everything else in the city is one of the most complicated issues in the history of New York man. Anyway, let me come back again, if I may, to Mr. Mosler. Mr. Mueller, is it realistic? Is it realistic to think of rebuilding the World Trade Center, this great landmark, which was, after all, built in the 1960s, and how much would it cost?
Well, again, Peter, I don't know how realistic it is at this point. I think that, as Joe pointed out, there are all kinds of issues and concerns relative to the damage that has been done, and structurally the ability to do it again is better left to engineers. But if anybody is capable of doing it, it's certainly Larry Silverstein. He's unique in that regard. In
terms of the reorganization of the business community here, and I'm not talking purely physical, plant operations and stuff like that, office, what are we looking at? A year, 2 years, 3 years, months before this begins to return to some semblance of normality?
You know, Peter, I think that New Yorkers are uniquely resilient, and I don't think we're talking years in any stretch of the imagination. I think that downtown, with people like Joe and the mayor's office, who have all done such an unbelievable job, I think you'll see downtown open sooner than you think. But I think business will be back to usual relatively soon. There are all kinds of caveats to that. But I go back to what I said in the beginning. New Yorkers are extraordinarily committed to seeing that what occurred does not impede their ability to do business.
Okay. Therefore, let me turn to Ken Lewis, who's the chairman and the CEO of the Bank of America. The Bank of America was the 6th largest tenant at the World Trade Center, and I know how you have suffered, sir, and I know how your employees are suffering. Can I ask you that question about returning to business as usual?
Well, Peter, I saw the first part of your program, and I too agree that it's hard to talk about going forward and the economy and things of that nature with this tragedy of such magnitude.
I agree, sir.
I do agree also that we do need to look forward, and that's the resolve of the American people, I think. With regard to doing business, we have about 4,000 associates in New York City, 418 of whom were in the World Trade Center. And so we quickly had a backup plan as our people regrouped, and some went to Secaucus, New Jersey, and then others went to buildings that we occupied in other parts of the city. And so we were back up and running almost immediately, or within a few hours after the tragedy.
Does this mean that for Bank of America, for example, the World Trade Center was not an absolutely central location?
It was not the place that had the most people. We occupy about 1.2 million square feet in New York, and this had some operational aspects to our business, but was not the biggest part of our business.
How many employees have you lost, by the way?
We have about 8 that we have not had personal contact with. We think that's going to go down to a number of 4 or 5.
What floor were you on in the World Trade Center?
Several. The tallest was the 81st or 82nd floor, and then 22nd also.
So in terms of how some companies suffered because they were in higher floors, you've been extraordinarily lucky.
I don't want to discount the loss of 4 or 5 lives, but yes, in percentage terms, we're very lucky.
Let me ask you a question so many people have asked us. One of the things, of course, we see in the resulting turmoil all over the area around the World Trade Centers, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of paper floating all over the place, which suggests somebody's records, at the very least. What happened to your records, and do you know what all those other pieces of paper are?
Well, usually there are 2 forms of data or information. One would be on paper, and then one would be through data transmission or other ways of storing it. And so you have that backup of the data transmission that's in other locations, which we did as well. So the paper was something that an individual was looking at, but the data in aggregate is in fact safe in most cases, I would guess.
As you're speaking, we're in fact looking at that absolute snowstorm of paper that, among other things, descended on the streets of New York. Is it just automatic procedure these days that every company, whether it's in New York City or Cincinnati or in Oklahoma or California, has a backup system elsewhere? I ask this question because so many people who have their personal interests in your financial hands and others are worried about their assets and their records.
Yes, 2 things. One, we do it because it's good business judgment, but we also have the added element of regulatory agencies having certain rules about us having the backup. And so we actually not only have auditors looking at it, but also regulatory bodies as well.
Mr. Lewis, Mr. Mosler, and Mr. Rose, if you just pause for a second, we're going to go to Andrews Air Force Base because, I beg your pardon, well, yes it is, Andrews Air Force Base, where the President has just landed on Marine One, having gone from the National Cathedral back very briefly to the White House, and is now about to come to New York City. It was the President, as we said earlier, who was, along with his family, instrumental in organizing the shape and the form of the presidential prayer service at the National Cathedral today. And when Air Force One takes off for New York, we do not know. You can say it out loud. The President is now on his way to Andrews? Oh, I see. Okay. I see your point. All right. We're talking basically about security for the President. And even as the President went in Marine One from the White House to Andrews Air Force Base, there were a couple of F-16s in the air accompanying the helicopter. I was about to say, which we presume to be absolutely accurate under the circumstances, that when the President leaves now in Air Force One for New York, which is not a long flight, as everybody knows, he will undoubtedly have a fighter escort in the skies as well. The only leg of his journey that we know that he'd had it on absolutely prior to this, I think, was when he returned from that North American Air Defense Command base in Nebraska, where he went after Louisiana, after Florida on Tuesday. But I remember ABC's Ann Compton, who traveled with the President for that entire day, saying that it was a great shock as they looked out the window just to see the presence of fighter jets on each wing, because, as Ann said, in the 26 years, I think she said, she had been traveling off and on with presidents, she had never seen it before. I think what she may have meant at the time, I haven't spoken to her on the subject, was that she didn't see it so close before, because it was right off the wing of Air Force One, and we never know precisely what kind of military security the President gets in the sky. But as the president boards Air Force One and leaves, let me ask you first, Mr. Lewis, chairman and CEO of Bank of America, a question to which I think the answer is pretty obvious. The president comes to New York today, and yes, it'll cause some complications on the ground, but it will be, I gather, a great lift for the community.
Absolutely, Peter. I think it's a necessary thing to do, the right thing to do, and I think it will have very, very positive psychological effects.
Many people have already raised the issue of how you finally settle into doing business as usual in New York City again. How long before Bank of America is up and running again as you were before this crisis?
Peter, we're actually up and running as we speak, and actually processed about the same number of transactions on Tuesday as we had in other days. And so we, again, you hate to use the word lucky, but we were fortunate in the sense that we did have the backup and that we could get up and running so quickly. May I add, too, that you asked the question about companies doing business in New York, and we obviously are one that does business. We have two very important businesses headquartered there, our investment banking business and our asset management and private banking business. Right. And they are very important to us. New York City was the financial capital of the world the first part of this week. It is the financial capital of the world now, and it will continue to be. And we will expand those businesses in New York. And frankly, over the next several years, we in fact would like to consolidate all of our business and build a high-rise also.
Well, I appreciate what you say, sir. I just wonder, it might say to you in return that I think we've seen in the country a good deal in the last year that in a period of considerable downsizing in a great many companies, companies have done whatever it takes to stay competitive in the world, or what they say is stay competitive, laid off workers left, right, and center in many, many companies and industries. Isn't, in the final analysis, business going to follow the dollar and settle where it can still be competitive and make money?
That's true, but the largest reservoir of financial talent in the world is in New York City, and so we plan to tap that reservoir and stay there and grow.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me turn back to Bruce Mosler at Cushman and Wakefield. We have seen, Mr. Mosler, some companies, as I said before, just suffer dreadfully. Are there any that you know which will not be able to get up and run again because they've suffered so grievously?
Peter, I don't think so. I think that what Mr. Lewis just said is sort of consistent for all of business. I think that all of them will be up and running. All of them are recommitting to New York, and I think he put it extraordinarily well. It is the reservoir for talent that brings people here and will keep them here. No, we're not aware of any that will not be back up and running.
Mr. Mosler, I think everybody in the country now respects the spirit of New York in this crisis. Mm-hmm. But in terms of reality, are you giving us the reality of redeveloping business here, or are you giving us the reality combined with the spirit of New York, and maybe that's just the way it is?
I think we're giving you the reality, period. I think, as we said before, there's 30 million square feet of available space that can be leased. And based on what we've seen so far in terms of tenants' demand and need, I think that we'll do very well.
Well, I want to thank you all. Bruce Mosler, the President of U.S. Operations for Cushman and Wakefield, Joseph Rose, the Director of the New York Department of City Planning, and Ken Lewis, the Chairman and the CEO of Bank of America, all of whom are individually and collectively enthusiastic about the prospects of rebuilding in New York and getting on with it. As Mr. Lewis said, pretty good summation. New York was the financial capital of the world before the crisis and is the financial capital of the world after the crisis. Gentlemen, thank you very much for giving us the time at a time when I know you're all very, very busy. Just one other thing about the World Trade Center. Well, actually, a couple of other things about the World Trade Center as we look at its remnants now. A good number of insurance leaders are calling for a Marshall Plan for Manhattan, part of which was approved today by the Congress in conjunction with the President's request to give New York whatever it needed to get up and running again. It is true that the New York developer who holds the lease, Larry Silverstein, for the New York Trade Center, said that his $3.2 billion lease is apparently insured against terrorism, though not against war. So goes the scuttlebutt, but he wants to build it again. And just as we look at it, before we move on to the investigation, it may be worth remembering that when the Trade Center was built, the architect who designed it, Minoru Yamasaki, said the following. A lot of New Yorkers have thought about this in the last couple of days. The World Trade Center should, because of its importance, become a living representation of man's belief in humanity, his need for individual dignity, his belief in the cooperation of men, and through his ability to find greatness. And there are a lot of people in New York City and probably in the country as a whole who believe at this moment, emotionally if not realistically, to think of the New York Trade Towers in that exact respect. My thanks again to all of those who came to help us. Now let's move on to the investigation. Pierre Thomas in New York. Pierre, in Washington, I'm sorry.
Peter, we have some new information from our producers out in Los Angeles. About an hour ago, United Flight 2, bound from Los Angeles to Dulles, armed federal agents went on board and detained 2 people. Again, that's in Los Angeles. The flight was bound from Los Angeles to Dulles. They went on board, detained 2 people, handcuffed them, and have removed them. We are seeing, again, another example of the FBI continuing to detain people that they think might somehow be involved with these particular attacks. But that's all the information we have at this particular point. The other information we have, Peter, is that about an hour ago, the Justice Department released the names of the people involved in these attacks. 19 people. And there are some interesting details if you look at the names very closely. The information released, 7 of these people, 7 of the 19 were pilots, Peter. We also are being told that of the 19, 11 were from Florida. Now, I talked to a number of sources about this information, and they're stunned at the level of sophistication. One source said the notion that you could have 4 hijackings all occur within roughly 1 hour, all occurring at 8 a.m. is stunning. And the source said that they are very, very surprised at the level of sophistication, and also the notion that all this planning could take place without the FBI or any intelligence agency having any information. The source said that it appears to be a quantum leap in the terrorist capability in the United States, Peter.
Okay, now let me just ask you one other question, Pierre, for the moment, about the incidents in New York last night, which so alarmed authorities at every level here while it was going on, and then which the FBI had some rethinking about overnight as it got closer and closer to the information. What is its current status? How many people of the 10 who were arrested at LaGuardia and New York are still being held, at LaGuardia and Kennedy?
Well, Peter, we think only about 3, and there's one person in particular that they still are somewhat interested in. This is the person who was a pilot. He came on board with a relative's identification. They were a little bit surprised by that. They couldn't understand that. They continued to interview him, but a source I talked to just an hour ago said that they do not think that they will be able to hold him much longer as well, Peter.
Okay, and was it the FBI that released the list of the names of those involved in the attack?
The FBI did release the names of those involved, and they're also encouraging the public by releasing those names to help them in this investigation. We're also expecting in the next few days for them to release the photographs. They've been telling us for the last 2 days that they want to release photographs, but sources are saying that they want to make certain that the photographs match the names. One of the difficulties they're having in the investigation is that these suspects use multiple identifications many times over.
You made the point exactly I was going to make, and others in the investigation. You can put those names up again if you like, have made repeatedly, that in many respects, these are all the people who were on the aircraft and where they seated. But these names may mean absolutely nothing because, among other things, several people who have studied the bin Laden organization have gone out using the same names operation after operation. So it is very difficult, with the one possible exception of Muhammad Atta there, just one name from the bottom, with whom we also have photographed. He's the one that got so much attention because he'd gone to pilot school in Florida. Most of those names are not necessarily going to mean anything. They may be aliases, they may be real names, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely, Peter.
Sorry, go ahead, Pierre.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. One source described these people as masters of diversion, and that not only did they have many fake IDs and false IDs, that they appear to have been casing these airports for more than a year, Peter.
And all those names could indeed have been made up. But what really is interesting this morning as the result of further investigation is that 7 of the 19 are pilots.
That is new information, and again, one of my sources said they are stunned that there were that many people prepared to be able to fly an airline.
What has not stunned them is investigation.
Again, they are moving along methodically, trying to go forward and find out more about these people. But you're right, Peter. This has really left law enforcement with their mouths open in many ways.
Many thanks, Pierre Thomas, who covers the Justice Department in general, the FBI in particular, for us in this given week. And when Pierre mentions the fact that federal officials have gone on to another flight this morning, United Airlines Flight 2, which was scheduled to leave Los Angeles, headed for Dulles Airport outside Washington, the country is once again, as it was last night with these incidents at Kennedy and LaGuardia, put very much on edge. So there's a universality to the on-edginess. Here's ABC's Jackie Judd.
In this state of high anxiety, every person, every threat, every sighting of someone or something suspicious is treated with deadly seriousness by law enforcement. Last night, all 3 New York area airports were closed and 10 people were detained in the belief that more hijackings were possibly being launched. By today, law enforcement had dialed back. 9 of the 10 have been released. The alarm and the action taken, all very necessary, says security analyst Larry Johnson.
It underscores that at this point, if you're going to make an error, you're going to make an error on the side of bringing in innocent people as opposed to ignoring somebody who may be guilty.
Gotta go out. The hypervigilance also led to a decision to expand the security perimeter around the White House. The administration let it be known that Vice President Cheney has been spending periods of time at Camp David. Authorities across the country are being equally cautious. 4 people at the Miami airport were detained after acting suspiciously and then released. 2 passengers on a cruise line were taken into custody in Miami early this morning. There have been countless evacuations because of threats or suspicious-looking packages at the Capitol, at New York's Grand Central Station, at the Embarcadero in San Francisco, the San Diego Zoo, Miami office buildings, and many more. This extreme sense of caution will be with us, of course, for some time. Security experts say many of these measures are taken after all terrorist acts, but because Tuesday's attack was so extraordinary, so too will the aftermath. Jackie Judd, ABC News, Washington.
The Secretary of State, Colin Powell, has just begun a briefing at the State Department.
In touch with a number of officials, in addition to the cabinet meeting and the very moving memorial service that we just had up at the National Cathedral earlier in the morning, I spoke to the Foreign Minister of India, Mr. Singh, and was very pleased to receive an exceptionally strong statement of support from the Indian government, and we had heard that previously, but he confirmed it this morning. I've also had conversations with Portuguese Foreign Minister, the Saudi Foreign Minister, Moroccan, Tunisian Foreign Ministers, my colleague, Foreign Minister Tanaka of Japan. I'll be speaking to the Israeli Defense Minister in a few moments, and I have a call into the Syrian Foreign Minister. And this will continue throughout the day for me. But beyond that, we have instructed our ambassadors around the world to go in and talk to their colleagues in those capitals to let them know how serious we are about this and begin to set the stage for any other requests we might have for them with respect to what we do as we go forward. In addition, our regional assistant secretaries here in the State Department have been inviting in ambassadors resident here in Washington to discuss the situation with them and to receive any questions they may have and to pass on any guidance that we have available to them. As you know, we are waiting to hear from President Musharraf of Pakistan, and I'm quite encouraged that the Pakistani government is taking this so seriously and so deliberately, and our ambassador is waiting for a reaction from them. I might also say that I'm pleased that the actions of the Australian government in activating the ANZUS Treaty as an expression of support, and a little similar to what NATO did, but those alliances that we hold dear and have used so effectively to keep us together as friendly nations over these many years are now, seems to me, paying off as people come forward to help us. I'm also pleased that expressions of support we have received from countries such as Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan and others are coming in. I don't have all of them on my list or in my memory, and Richard Boucher will, in the course of the day, let you know who we have heard from and what kind of responses we have received from them. And let me just stop there and take a couple of questions before I have to make a phone call.
Any indications of what the Pakistan, whether you get a positive response from Pakistan, you're going to call the Syrian, any indications yet of their position?
Yes, the Syrians, President Assad sent to President Bush a very strong letter of support in efforts against terrorism. Now, of course, we have had a mixed relationship with Syria over the years, and in the course of my conversation, hopefully this afternoon with my colleague, I'll pursue the spirit of the letter that President Assad sent to President Bush and see where that takes us.
And any indications from the Pakistanis, even though there's no final answer?
So far, I am very encouraged, but I think it's best that I do wait for a final answer.
Mr. Secretary, Indian media says that that government handed over some maps to you today of guerrilla camps and other training areas that Afghanistan is said to be using. Can you confirm that that's...
I can't confirm it. I just don't know. Richard could chase that down for you, but I can't confirm it here. It wasn't mentioned to me in my phone call at about 9 or 9:30 or 10, whenever I had, or about 10:30, I guess it was, with the Indian Foreign Minister.
Mr. Secretary, we've heard a lot, yourself and other cabinet members and officials say, as we reach out to countries and ask for help, you're either with us or you're against us. Now, of course, we hope that all countries are be with us, but if we ask for something from a country, we ask them to root out terrorism in all its forms or to provide logistical or any type of other support that we need for any eventual military response. If they decline, if they say that they won't do what the U.S. asks, what are the consequences for, quote, being against us?
I think we have to be careful as we go forward, and we intend to be. We're talking with countries that are friendly to us, and we will present requests to them and see what they are able to do within their capacity and within their political circumstances. But if we find a particular country, especially those that might be serving as a haven or as a well-known supporter of this kind of activity, and they are simply unresponsive, and we deem that unresponsiveness to be contributing to additional terrorism or to the fertile ground in which terrorism thrives, then that will certainly affect the kind of relationship we're going to have with them in the future. I am not threatening so much as I am saying this has become a new benchmark, a new way of measuring the relationship and what we can do together in the future and what kind of support we can provide to you in the future across a whole range of issues and activities. Yeah.
Mr. Secretary, the last 2 days you've been saying that how important you think it is that despite the events here, that the tragic events here, that it's still very, very important for the Israelis and the Palestinians to have high-level meetings between Chairman Arafat and former Mr. Perez. Now, Prime Minister Sharon has now called that meeting off. And secondly, you're speaking to the Israeli defense minister later. Are you going to bring up his comments that were quoted in an Israeli newspaper this morning in which he said that the disasters in New York and here were a catastrophe for Arafat because the Israelis had killed 14 Palestinians since then and no one had noticed?
I don't know what we'll discuss. I haven't seen those comments, but I know him rather well, and I'm sure we'll have many things to discuss, but I won't prejudge what I might raise or what he might raise and announce it before he raises it or I raise it. I would still hope that a way is found for the Israelis and the Palestinians to meet. When they meet is a judgment for them to make. We have two leaders who have to judge their own interest. We believe a meeting is important to get the process started. This conflict isn't going away, and I don't think it's going to be solved by continuing conflict between the two sides. So I hope that conditions will present themselves soon so that a meeting can begin. But I think it is also fair to say that the events of the 11th of September have fundamentally changed the way in which people look at terrorism and acts of terrorism.
Secretary Powell, as your strategy to fight global terrorism begins to take shape and as these international coalitions that you've been trying to build solidify, it's obviously a very different war that you're preparing to fight in that the enemy is not in one country. Could you explain this to us?
Yeah, I was raised a soldier, and you're trained. There is the enemy occupying a piece of ground. We can define it in time, space, and other dimensions, and you can assemble forces and go after it. This is different. The enemy is in many places. The enemy is not looking to be found. The enemy is hidden. The enemy is very often right here within our own country. And so you have to design a campaign plan that goes after that kind of enemy. And it isn't always blunt force military, although that is certainly an option. It may well be that the diplomatic efforts, political efforts, legal, financial, other efforts may be just as effective against that kind of an enemy as would military force be. And the point the president made this morning is that the whole cabinet's involved, and we're going to use all the tools and weapons at our disposal to fight this campaign and to win this war. I only have time for one more, and I apologize. Let me say, who haven't I? Go.
Do you have a message for the Taliban?
Yes. Is it a vote? That's the question? All right. The message is, to the extent that you are providing havens, support, encouragement, and other resources to organizations such as the organization headed by Mr. Osama bin Laden, that is attacking civilization, that is killing innocent people. And I would give this message to any other regime in any other country that might be doing similar things. To the extent that you are doing these sorts of things, even though we have not yet, notwithstanding words like prime suspect, we have not yet identified Osama bin Laden as the direct perpetrator, but the evidence, we have a lot of evidence is mounting, which will allow us to determine in the near future who it is. But he certainly is the leader of that kind of organization, and to the extent that governments such as the Taliban government in Afghanistan support such things, you need to understand you cannot separate your activities from the activity of these perpetrators. And in our response, we will have to take into account not only the perpetrators, but those who provide haven, support, inspiration, financial, and other assets to the perpetrators, as the president said in his very first set of remarks some days ago. Thank you. I do have to go. Thank you.
The Secretary of State, Colin Powell, being asked a question I think that everybody in the White House, in the State Department press room would have asked, and it just happened to be asked by the last question there. Does Mr. Powell have a message for the Taliban? And while he very carefully framed it so as to be an answer to any country, not just particularly Afghanistan, he says basically the following: to the extent that you are giving support or have to organizations led by Osama bin Laden, and then he digressed to say that we've not yet identified Mr. bin Laden as a direct perpetrator in this particular crisis. You cannot separate yourself from the activities of those organizations. And so, very clear, George Stephanopoulos, the response will include you.
No question about it, although it seemed to have the quality of not a judgment but an ultimatum, sort of giving them one last chance. To the extent you're harboring him, you're going to face the consequences. In other words, giving them the chance. If you want to give him up, it's your choice. If you don't, you're going to pay the consequences. And that was very striking. It was also, I have to say, slightly odd to me, Peter, naming Osama bin Laden, but then getting and saying he's the prime suspect, but saying we don't have the evidence yet. He doesn't leave himself much of a way out.
Well, I wonder whether or not he's speaking specifically to that which the national government has put together, or whether he is talking to the general environment of conversation and blame, that seems to be the whole country is involved in.
I think that could be one thing. I think it could also be that they might just be waiting for some specific pieces of evidence from the FBI or the CIA. They know they're coming, but they just want to be able to catalog it almost in a legalistic fashion before they make the charge.
There has been tremendous pressure, or at least as best the world can exert pressure, on the ruling Taliban in Afghanistan before to give up Osama bin Laden. When this attack occurred, it was the Taliban who said we weren't involved and Osama bin Laden wasn't involved. A pretty clear indication that there was a connection, and he may well be there. This morning, the supreme leader of Afghanistan's ruling Taliban movement, Mullah Muhammad Omar, urged Afghans to boldly face an American retaliation for these attacks of terror on the United States, which he clearly anticipates. The militia, the national organization's radio, which is monitored in Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, quoted him as asking Afghans to be patient and steadfast, and this is the quote, face any American attack with courage and self-respect. Afghanistan, at least in the form of training camps, which the U.S. believes belong to Osama bin Laden, has been attacked before. And boy, are they used to violence in that country.
They're used to violence. They're used to attacks of all kinds. I thought one other interesting thing from Secretary Powell's press conference, Peter, the gentle encouragement of Pakistan. We'd heard very tough talk before from administration officials saying we really need them to give us all of our requests, and Secretary Powell seemed to be more encouraging at the opening of this press conference today.
Well, he did say that we're waiting to hear a response from General Musharraf. And the United States, we know, the new American ambassador to Pakistan, as well as the Secretary of State. I don't think the President has spoken to General Musharraf. I don't know. I don't think he has, or at least we haven't been told he has gone in with a list of very specific requests from Pakistan, that they stop allowing fuel to get from Pakistan to Afghanistan, which is already in violation of United Nations sanctions, that they stop allowing travel by anybody out of Afghanistan who the Pakistanis know is intending on committing some act of violence somewhere else. And I've forgotten what the third one is, but there's several.
And this is going to be very difficult for a lot of Afghani neighbors. We have a quote from another senior administration official who says that the nations that we're talking to now have to realize that these steps we're asking them to take are going to be very difficult for them. They're going to have to seize assets, make arrests, and act on a number of fronts that even our closest allies are going to find as a challenge. That's for Pakistan and a lot of other countries.
Yeah, in fact, as we go to Martha Raddatz at the State Department, there's another quote from a senior administration official today, Martha, which says, today's story, I tend to see the world in terms of stories, but this was his language, is really the dirty diplomatic work of laying it on the line to all countries regarding what it's going to take to meet our expectation of what needs to be done. Is that the clear message going up from the State Department in every respect?
It is the clear message, and it's going out around the world. The U.S. ambassadors abroad are telling the ambassadors, the leaders of the countries they are in, they're giving them that very strong message. They are talking in somewhat general terms about this, but there are several countries getting specific lists. Pakistan is certainly one of them, and the specifics that you just mentioned.
Now, by the way, President Bush has not spoken to General or President Musharraf. Right.
No, he has not. As
yeah.
far as we know, he has not spoken to him. It has been Secretary Powell.
Perhaps it would be helpful if we put up a map at the moment for people who are not altogether familiar with the geography of the subcontinent. But it's also, as you heard of the briefing there, the Indians talking about training camps in Afghanistan. One thing we know from the United States, so you see Afghanistan and then Pakistan, and they're over on the right on the lower part of your screen, and up where Pakistan and India meet, there's this dreadfully troubled area of Kashmir to the right on that map of the capital Islamabad, or to the south right. And there are some of the other countries of the region which are all of concern to the United States, but there's several names not on that map at the moment. In terms, Martha, I gather, of the current focus, they include other nations around Afghanistan, which were states of the former Soviet Union and are now independent states.
Uzbekistan, this really stretches around the world, Peter. I was just reading the most recent report out of the State Department on this named about 26 countries where they believe Osama bin Laden has cells operating, again, throughout the Mideast, but it reaches into South America, the United Kingdom, and I noticed one line in the most recent report, it said allegedly in the United States. I guess they'll have to change that one.
Well, exactly, and the Secretary did say at this point, in terms of talking about the country's enemies, including here in the United States. How concerned are they with let's just take three of these countries in the former Soviet Union, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan? Three names with which Americans are utterly unfamiliar, but in the war against terrorism, people are increasingly familiar.
I think those are the kind of places that you will see more specific messages going out from the State Department, asking for specific things to happen, about closing borders, exactly the kinds of things they're talking to Pakistan about. I want to just say, Peter, also, I caught up with Secretary Powell after he left the briefing, and I asked him a question, something we've been hearing a lot about. I said, do you believe, are you confident that there are no more attacks planned in the coming days, in the coming weeks? And he actually stopped for a moment, and he was very careful. It seemed like he wanted to say yes, but he said, all I can say is people should be cautious. Then he said, you should ask the FBI those questions and other agencies and intelligence agencies. But he said, you should definitely be cautious.
Well, I think that's the message from government in general, and given what happened on United Airlines this morning, I shouldn't say what, yeah, just given those arrests on United Airlines, leaving Los Angeles today for Dulles Airport in Washington, given what happened in New York last night, given the suspicions that everybody here has in the government, that there is perhaps a wider circle of operatives who assisted in Tuesday's operation, that seems like a pretty sensible answer.
I think it seems sensible as well, and others, senior administration official I spoke to this morning had a bit stronger answer. He said, we don't believe this was just for Tuesday. We believe this may be some sort of long-term operation, and again, caution is advised.
It is true, Martha, that the immediate violence between the Israelis and the Palestinians has taken, at least in terms of the world's attention, has taken very much second place to everything that's happened here. But what is the level of violence there today? And what does the United States think it can do about it, if anything?
Well, the United States keeps giving us the same line. We want to stick to the Mitchell Plan. I'm not sure exactly what's gone on in Israel today, but the level of violence seems to go up and down, as you know. Most of the times it goes up. There hasn't been a lot of focus on this region because of what's happened in the United States, but Secretary Powell has been in touch with the leaders there. They are still making efforts to get these two sides together to get this violence stopped, because they think in many ways that may be contributing to all that's going on here as well.
Is there, for all of the increased security precautions around the world, is there particular attention being given to American installations in the Middle East? Because we know that because in the Arab world, the United States is perceived as being biased, prejudiced, leaning towards Israel all the time, that the American position in the United States is in lower regard than it's been for a very long time.
My experience over there, and I've been over there fairly recently, is that those embassies in that region are always hardened. They are always on a higher state of alert, and I don't think they can get much higher, but obviously they're looking around, they're gathering intelligence in any way they can to see not only what is contributing to the violence there, but here as well. And that's another point they've made at the State Department. What they want all these nations to do, that they're reaching out to, is share intelligence. If you have any information about what went on in the United States on Tuesday or what might go on in the future, they expect those countries to share that information with the United States, and they're making quite a point about that.
Okay, thanks very much, Martha Raddatz of the State Department. There is fear and anxiety all over the Middle East at the moment, and there is in the community as a whole a real deep sense of ambiguity. The Sheikh at prayers today in Baghdad criticized people in the region who sympathized with the victims of the bombing against the United States. And then in Jordan, a preacher at the mosque there urged worshipers to pray for the U.S. victims, reminding us again, you cannot generalize about the Arab world, George. I'm always taking you backwards, I know, and you've done a fabulous job of reporting for us, but I'm always taking you back. When President Clinton was in office, deeply engaged in what he ultimately hoped would be some kind of resolution between the Israelis and Palestinians, did he generally, as other presidents have, feel this was a tremendous burden? But the United States always had to play a role.
Oh, I think there was no question in President Clinton's mind that he had to play a role, particularly, and this is going back quite a ways now, but particularly after the meeting on the White House lawn in September of 1993. Remember, that meeting came about almost as a surprise without the direct involvement of the United States. The Israelis and the Palestinians had reached an agreement on their own, but they wanted the United States to help ratify it. And I think President Clinton felt from that day forward the United States had a special responsibility to help implement the peace, and of course that led to his efforts at the Y Accords, the Y Plantation, and then later at Camp David. I spoke to, this was actually after I left the White House, but I spoke to a close aide of the president who worked day to day on the Middle East in the president's last year, and he said that President Clinton almost every single day in his last year in office would say, I only have X days left. We have to focus on this. He felt that burden.
Here's another reminder today of how things are more complex in those countries about which we sometimes have a single image. One of the most conservative clerics in Iran today said publicly that he was heartbroken, this is the quote, heartbroken over the terror attacks in the United States, a country that many of his allies within Iran still see as the great Satan. Iran is a very divided country in many ways. There was never any unity at the time about holding Americans hostage, even though it seemed so from a distance at the time, but there was never any unanimity in Iran about holding the Iranians hostage, and there is no unanimity in Iran at the moment about how the country should move forward or whether it should have a relationship with the United States. There are millions of Iranians, 52 million in the country, I think maybe 55 million Iranians, and many of them are desperate to have a relationship with the United States and deeply resent, thinking of George here, President Clinton's not making more of an effort to reestablish relations between a country which so many people in America thought of as the enemy for such a long period of time. Let me move on now to the Congress. ABC's Linda Douglas is on Capitol Hill. Linda, we saw many members of the House and the Senate. I'm not sure all, but we saw many members of the House and Senate at the National Presidential Prayer Service. Did everybody go?
Everybody did not go. Of course, as you point out, it was invited guests. It's not clear to me that all of the members, all 535 members of Congress, were actually invited guests. There were a few who stayed behind, but all both of the houses went out during the memorial service, and they were all those members who were not participating in the service were certainly glued to the television.
Now, can we talk about this, the text of this joint resolution? It's something we should get up on the screen after a while, but in very general terms, there has been at least a text released of a joint resolution authorizing the use of force against, as you said earlier today, terrorists.
Right.
Adopted by the Senate. It's already been adopted by the Senate.
It has been adopted by the Senate. It was a vote of 98 to 0. There was a senator who was on his way to his son's wedding who was desperate to get there, and there was another senator who was stuck in traffic. So the two senators who didn't vote didn't do that out of any oversight or any resistance to that. It was 98 to 0. And it does authorize the president to use force against those who engaged in this act of terrorism. It is not an open-ended opportunity for the president to use force forever and in any circumstance against any terrorism in the future. It's specifically confined to those who perpetrated this act.
In fact, it's very, very delicately worded, is it not? And it sounds to us like the compromise we talked about yesterday between the White House, which wanted greater authority, and certainly the Democrats in Congress, which were nervous about investing this or any White House with greater singular authority. Fair?
Well, that's absolutely true. There were a series of bipartisan meetings. You've been talking about bipartisanship all day. Senior Republicans like Republican John Warner of Virginia, who was for a long time the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Also, Democrat Joseph Biden, chairman now of the Foreign Relations Committee. We are told that Biden had a lot to do with coming up with language that was satisfactory to both sides, that would acknowledge the president and commander-in-chief's authority to engage in any action to protect and defend the United States, would also acknowledge that the Congress has to authenticate that authority, but still would put some limits on the authority so that it wouldn't get out of control, as you've been hearing all day, as the Gulf of Tonkin resolution did during the Vietnam War.
I'm taking a quick look at the references in here to the War Powers Act, and to be perfectly honest, on short notice, I can't understand exactly what they intend to say. But Congress clearly wants the War Powers Act to be always a factor in the negotiations between the White House and the Congress in terms of using force.
That's right, because the Congress always wants to ensure that it has its constitutionally perceived, its perceived constitutional role in participating in any action that the president takes to try to engage in hostilities. And presidents along the way have, especially since the Vietnam War, acknowledged the authority of Congress, but without wanting to acknowledge that Congress could actually tie its hands. The members of Congress all day long have been saying things, Peter, to the president to make clear to him that they want to give him as wide a berth in this as possible. The chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the House, for example, today said, we're not going to be calling the administration up here and asking for you to explain everything you want to do. Just go ahead and do it.
Thanks, Linda. The Attorney General.
From a memorial service at the National Cathedral, and wanted to take this time to give you a report in regard to these matters. Today, the Federal Bureau of Investigation released a list of 19 individuals who have been identified as hijackers aboard the 4 airliners that crashed on Tuesday. The FBI requests that anyone who may have information about these individuals, even though these individuals are presumed to be dead, anyone with information about these individuals immediately contact an FBI field office or call the toll-free hotline. The toll-free hotline, as you know, is 1-866-483-5137. 1-866-483-5137. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has also forwarded a list of more than 100 names to numerous law enforcement organizations. These are the names of individuals the FBI would like to talk to, because we believe they may have information that could be helpful to the investigation. The organizations that we have submitted these names to include the Federal Aviation Administration, the airlines, FBI field offices, about 18,000 police departments across America, the U.S. Border Patrol, and the U.S. Customs Service. Now, the nature of this list is that it would be changing constantly as people are either removed from it or added to it. But we believe that the individuals on the list may have information that could be helpful to us in our efforts. I want to take this moment to extend our appreciation to state and local law enforcement organizations that have cooperated with this investigation, have acted responsibly, and have been very helpful to us. Their dedication and swift action has been essential to the progress of the investigation. I'm pleased now to call upon the director to give you some more information.
Before we answer questions, I thought I would fill you in on the extent of the investigation to date. As of today, we have 4,000 FBI special agents who are working on the case in various offices around the country and on various aspects of the investigation, and we have 3,000 support employees also on the investigation. 20 FBI legat offices are running down leads overseas, and all 56 FBI offices around the country are engaged in the investigation. We have conference calls several times a day to make certain that everything is being coordinated appropriately. To date, we have had more than 36,000 total leads. Of those, over 30,000 have come in off the internet. 3,800 have been received on the FBI hotline, and another 2,400 have been generated through the various field offices. As you well know, and have picked up, we've conducted hundreds of interviews around the country. We've served over 30 search warrants in various places. Hundreds of subpoenas have been issued, and we have, in the course of seizing some of those executing some of those search warrants, we have seized computers, other documentary information that we are following up on. One other point I'd make before we respond to questions, and that is that we have dispatched sent to the various major airports, FBI agents, teams of FBI agents, to assist in quickly resolving any incidents that may come up when passengers or passengers are attempting to board an aircraft or obtain a ticket, and there's some question raised, so we can minimize the inconvenience to the person who may well be stopped, and also swiftly resolve the issue. And with that, I believe we're happy to take whatever questions you might have.
Director, have you obtained under seal or otherwise any fugitive injustice warrants or leveled any kind of charges against anyone in this investigation?
Well, for under seal, I probably couldn't tell you, but I can say that there have been no FBI arrests at this time. Any detentions that have occurred have been pursuant to immigration holds where an individual has been out of status.
On the list of hijackers, have they been connected to organizations connected to Bin Laden?
And I can't get into the details of that.
Astonish you that...
Sorry, we'll take one and then two. Yes, ma'am. Sorry.
Astonish you that they trained, all their training came to the U.S., there were so many of them trained as pilots, and that they lived in the open, they weren't hiding their identities here. Did any of that astonish you or shock you?
Well, the tragedies quite clearly astonish and shock me and the country. The fact that there were a number of individuals that happened to receive training at flight schools here is news, quite obviously. If we had understood that to be the case, we would have, perhaps one could have averted this. But beyond that, I and I think everybody else is just astonished at the extent of the tragedy as a result of what happened last Tuesday. Yes, sir.
Director, there were 2 people removed from the flight last night, I guess, in New York, and those two people's names appeared on a list. How did they get on? How were they able to board if their names were on?
Well, I can tell you that that was pursuant to a watch list. Other than those names were pursuant, were on the watch list for reasons not related to this investigation.
On the list of the hijackers, 2 quick questions. One is there are several shared last names. Were many of them related to one another? And the second question is Delray Beach and Hollywood, Florida seem to be very common residences. Do you know whether those were like bases of operation for these men?
I can't. We are still, while we have the names for the manifests and are still pursuing investigations of those names to try to document and absolutely be certain that the person who went down the plane fits with the name on the manifest. The further association of the names we're still investigating.
Can you tell us about...
All I can say that there are a number of places in the country, without specifying any particular place, where we have conducted a number of interviews and several search warrants, and executed several search warrants.
Tell us about a D.C. police all-points bulletin being put out about a silver or gray minivan. They may be carrying a chemical weapon.
I can't tell you anything about that. Yes, sir.
What have you learned from the cockpit voice recorder and from the flight data recorders of the 2 planes?
They're currently over at the NTSB, and I think the question should be directed to the NTSB on those at this instant.
They referred us to you.
As of this moment, we have not learned or received anything off those recorders. Well, actually, I should say we have not received anything off the voice data recorder. There is that recorder, which is other than the voice data recorder at the Pentagon that we picked up, and we did receive information off that.
What did that tell you about that flight, about its path?
I can't get into that now, sir. Yes, sir.
what confidence do you have that the names on the list are actually the people who were on the plane as opposed to aliases or stolen identities? Do you have a level of confidence there yet?
I think we have a fairly high level of confidence, but when we spoke to you yesterday, we had 18 individuals who we believed were the hijackers. We now have a 19th that our investigation has disclosed was probably one of the hijackers on that plane that left Dulles, and consequently, continuous investigation updates our confidence or level of confidence, degree of confidence in assuring that the person who actually was on the plane is associated with the name. Yes, sir.
Those 19 any suspects or individuals who are still at large who may have been the leaders or masterminds of this conspiracy?
I'm sorry, what?
Have you identified any suspects who you believe are still at large in the United States who are the masterminds or leaders of this conspiracy?
I cannot get into the details of the investigation. Suffice it to say, if we believe that there is somebody in the United States who is associated with this conspiracy and we had evidence upon which to base a charge, we would have and would level that charge. Yes, sir.
Can you say anything about the immigration status of the 19? Were any of them out of legal status?
I believe we tried to provide some of those visa details on the listing that we provided to you. I can say that some of them were out of status, yes. I'm not certain how many or which names or which individuals whose names appeared on the manifest and we believe to be a hijacker was out of status. Yes.
It's common for the FBI to name a case agent in a big case. Have you yet done that on this one?
The investigation is being run by Tom Picard out of headquarters here with Dale Watson and numerous other, I would say, senior FBI agents assisting in various capacities.
And the name of the investigation, sir. Has the investigation been given a name, and what is it?
Pent bomb. P-E-N, Pent bomb. P-E-N-T-B-O-M-B. Pent bomb.
Can you address the issue of intelligence failure? You didn't know anything about any of these guys. We still don't know a lot about them.
That was the last question. Thank you. Thank you.
Robert Mueller, the director of the FBI, and John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, on their daily briefing. I think the headline is there. And I'm joined by ABC's John Miller. No arrests whatsoever as a result of this investigation so far, but a number of detentions, all based on what are called Immigration and Naturalization Service holds. The INS has an enormous amount of freedom and flexibility to hold people for an indeterminate period of time. So that makes sense from the department's point of view.
It does, and in this particular case, it's going to be an advantage, at least from a strategic point. We can argue about fairness, but from a strategic point, the FBI gets to do with foreign nationals something it wouldn't really have the ability to do with U.S. citizens, which is use the INS to put holds on them, and particularly when those holds have to do with visa information, that foreign counterintelligence information about alleged associations with terrorists. The federal courts have shown a good degree of patience with them, holding them for a long time.
Let me ask you this question then, because it's probably an important one in terms of the next several days. You're absolutely correct, not that I'm surprised, about the INS being able to hold foreign nationals under these circumstances. But does that suggest that none of the 19, that none of those have been picked up so far are American? I'm sorry, I don't want to get confused here. Forget the 19, forget I even said that.
Right, but none of those being detained.
That's right, none of those being detained now are American citizens in
Correct.
this case.
Or they wouldn't have the ability to hold them without charging them. The other headline, if there is one out of this press conference, is that they have supplied airports, 18,000 police agencies, the Border Patrol, U.S. Customs, and the airlines with 100 names of people sought for questioning in connection with this investigation, and he said that will be a revolving list where names are added and taken off on a constant basis as they learn of new people or they question people who are on the existing list.
Very broad authority for the FBI, again, going to these airports all over the country, too, to resolve issues if they come up and there are questions between passengers and airlines.
I think exactly, which will probably give them an advantage over a situation like last night. But it's also interesting that since the names are supplied to the airlines, I think it's implicit there that if you're one of the people they even want to talk to in this case, you're not getting on an airplane before you do.
Exactly, exactly. George, you have any impressions, George Stephanopoulos, any impressions from this? We did say that it is we noted, let's put it this way, that Mr. Mueller, who's brand new in the job, feels very comfortable in public.
No question about it. He's been a career civil servant both in the Justice Department as a U.S. attorney out in California, and he seems, as you say, very comfortable man who's also been practiced, I believe, in the courtroom on high-profile trials, and he showed that comfort today. But that does bring up an important point. So much of what the country is going to key off of is the attitude, not just of the president, but of the people who work for him. Remember, that's in many ways how Colin Powell made his reputation with the public back during the Persian Gulf War.
And today it was interesting also to see the Attorney General John Ashcroft defer to Mueller, Mr. Ashcroft taking far less of the news conference than he has on previous occasions. Let's go to Pierre Thomas in Washington. Pierre.
Unit category.
Me is we're getting a better sense of the scope of the investigation. They said that they had done 30 search warrants. Computers have been seized. They've interviewed hundreds of witnesses and potential people who might know information. And I agree with John Miller that the fact that there are 100 names of people that they have forwarded to law enforcement shows you again that this is a massive, massive investigation.
Okay, thanks very much, Pierre. Now let us turn our attention to the president. President, as you saw a short while ago, left for New York. One of the very first things doing while he is here is to see the mayor, and I suspect the governor as well, because Governor Pataki and Mayor Giuliani have been inseparable practically since this crisis began. Where one goes, therefore, there goes the other, at least certainly in terms of public appearances, which have anything to do with talking to the public in a formal way. Dan Harris, one of our correspondents here, gives us some sense now of what President Bush is actually going to see in downtown New York.
Like Peter Schmittig, many of the people who live in the secure zone are doing so without electricity.
We do have to walk upstairs with the dog 3-4 times a day. It seems tough, but it's not that tough.
Easier, perhaps, for him to be upbeat. At least he can get home. Many others, including the Ruttman family, return every day only to get turned away.
Move back behind the barrier, right over there.
I can't get my medication. Our pharmacies are burnt down. You know, the doctors, nobody's answering. You can't get in every time you try and call anywhere down here. It's busy. They told us, we called the building. They tell us there's somebody there waiting for you. They'll let you in. Just call the number. Keep calling the number, and nobody's answering. It's busy and busy and busy.
While much of lower Manhattan has now opened up, a large portion south of Canal Street, an area that used to exist in the shadow of the World Trade Center, is still locked down tight. Normal life has ceased. Trendy restaurants closed, convenience stores lit only by candlelight, the newspaper stands still displaying Tuesday morning's headlines. It is now a sort of police state. National Guard checkpoints, huge stockpiles of emergency supplies, streets lined with bombed-out cars.
It literally feels like we're under siege down here, a war. It looks like a living war, and then you have to use your ID just to get home.
Compounding the deprivation, the nagging knowledge of their proximity to such enormous suffering.
There's this horrible thing, you know, all people dying, you know, just to be, you know, we're 7 blocks from where it happened, but living on top of a burial ground.
What strikes you, Peter, when you come down here, I drove down here last night, is that there is essentially a huge divide between uptown and downtown. Uptown has approached or is making a rough facsimile of normalcy. Downtown, as soon as you get here, you realize you are in close proximity to a major, major disaster. And there are a lot of people who are living here, as we just showed you. We have found, however, that there is a lot of persistence. Around the corner over here, we saw a sign. Drew Milhan, my producer, and I were walking. There was a sign hanging out of a window that said, "Here to stay."
Thanks very much, Dan Harris, down there. There's always a little thing in every single report we have which is so telling. There's the newspaper headline from the day on which it happened still in the newspaper boxes there, and the woman who says she has to use her ID in order to get home. This is true particularly in the surrounding area of the World Trade Center, and I think that everybody who goes down to the site itself or even gets close to the site itself recognizes something that is almost unique to them. This morning with the police commissioner down there, you know, I noticed buckets, because piles of them everywhere. Everywhere you looked this morning down there close to the hole, there were buckets stashed, and that, of course, is a reflection of how they're doing this carefully by hand, and there's this long chain, this bucket brigade, mostly of firemen, moving material away from the hole, as they call it, the absolute, if there is an epicenter below of this destruction, moving away this material with such care lest they get close to finding someone who was alive inside. Now, we don't know where President Bush landed in or around New York. The security around the president clearly is very intense, as it should be, and there has been no announcement from the White House about where he was going to land. But we know he is in the area, and that one of the very first people he's going to see is the mayor of New York City, Rudolph Giuliani. We noted late last night, I think, as we were getting to the end of one segment of the broadcast, that the president's ratings, the approval rating as we call it in the ABC News poll, which has been now taken twice in the last several days, is at 91%. And my guess is, and it's only a guess at this point, that if you ask New Yorkers how their mayor had done this week, his personal approval ratings would be extremely high, and he was, in many respects, a very divisive figure before that. But here is ABC's James Walker on the man who has had some extraordinary week.
From the first moment, there has been no question about who is in command.
Put your mask on. Put your mask on. Now put it down.
Mayor, what's the situation right now?
The situation is that 2 airplanes have attacked, apparently.
No time for talk. That would come later. He had to find out what was happening. So when word came about the attacks, he went to the scene, into harm's way, to be with fellow New Yorkers.
Let's talk a little later, okay?
Mr. Mayor, you were one of the first people down there. Can you describe the scene in your own words, what you saw down there?
I don't know that I'm really able to describe it. It was the most horrific scene I've ever seen in my whole life. We saw the World Trade Center in flames, a big gaping hole all the way on the top of it. We could see people jumping from the top of the building. And then we went into Barclay Street, 75 Barclay Street, I think it was, and we were there when the building collapsed, and it collapsed in part on 75 Barclay Street.
Did you ever fear for your own safety, sir?
Sure, yeah.
When people really were frightened, when people were screaming and crying and running down the streets blindly, Giuliani said, "Calm down, I'm in charge." And we desperately were looking for someone to be in charge.
There was so much to worry about. The thousands of people trapped or dead at the Trade Center, including firefighters and cops. Electricity out in large parts of Manhattan. 200,000 phone lines crippled. And Giuliani acted in part like a reassuring manager.
560-2730. If you have questions throughout the night and tomorrow, that's the number to call.
And a tough manager at that.
Anybody that thinks that they're going to gouge consumers or ask for extra amounts of money for food or anything else, we're going to have the police and the Consumer Affairs Department out there. So just be careful.
He was everywhere, at a downtown armory where families had gathered holding pictures of their missing loved ones, encouraging rescue crews.
Unbelievable. Great job. Within 12
In press conference after press conference, he answered questions in his direct, no-nonsense style.
The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear, ultimately.
He also offered words of comfort.
But if tomorrow is a day in which you want to stay home and stay with your family and give comfort and support maybe to other people that have been affected by this, it would be a good day to do that.
To many people, the Giuliani of the last few days is a far different politician from the Giuliani they knew before. The man often criticized for being authoritarian, insensitive to minorities and civil liberties.
Democracy, not dictatorship.
This week, like so much else that's been forgotten, almost everyone agrees that at this moment, he's given the city exactly what it needs.
He's been doing a great job, and I can't believe I'm saying that.
I'm not a Giuliani friend, but he's doing a good job.
This city is the greatest city in the world. It has the greatest people, and a bunch of cowardly terrorists can't make us fearful. We're stronger than they are. We're better than they are. And people of the city proved it yesterday. They're going to prove it today. And they're going to be a great example of what Americans are like. Thank you.
One other thing almost forgotten, the primary election to replace the mayor. Excuse me, I can't hear myself right here. The primary election to replace the mayor was supposed to take place on Tuesday, the day of the blast. It has been rescheduled. There are a lot of New Yorkers who feel now that getting through the rest of this crisis will be a lot more difficult without Rudy Giuliani at the helm. Peter?
Very much, James Walker. One of the things we always notice every time we see the mayor is how often he changes, but he goes back and forth, and a lot of people in New York don't have that luxury at the moment to be able to change clothes at the time, but he does it very, I'm not sure calculatingly at all, but very carefully, and the two uniforms he almost invariably wears represent the New York Police Department or the New York Fire Department. He began early in the week with a hat from the fire department and a sweatshirt from, or a jacket, I've forgotten what it was, from the police department. And you see it every time. Every mayor in New York City, every mayor in every city wants to identify with the police and the fire department. In this case, this mayor has a history of identification with the police and the fire department, an identification with the police which, by the way, angers many members of the community, particularly in the minority community, who think the police have acted in an untoward fashion, at the least to them. But the mayor is very much identified with the police and the fire department. Am I fair on that, John Mueller?
You are. You left out the third uniform, though. That's his neutral stance, is the Yankee uniform.
Yeah, but I haven't seen the Yankee hat this week.
No, you won't see it this week. But in times of peace, that's his other choice. But
Yeah.
the way
I
that
come from
works,
a Mets family, so you can imagine how difficult that is.
the way that works is if he wears the fire department hat, the commissioner always sends an aide over with a police department hat, and then the fire commissioner. So he must have thousands of these hats by now. You know, because once he appears on television wearing one agency's hat or the other guy says immediately, get him a police windbreaker, or then send him a fire sweater, and it goes back and forth.
Listen, again, not to be frivolous about this, because I'm almost positive that the first place the mayor is going to take the president after they've had a good private conversation about what the city needs is going to be to the trade towers. But what else do you think the mayor wants the president to see here?
Well, I mean, I would take some of my cues off of the tour that Tommy Thompson took, which was to the scene and then to the morgue. Now, he has a Health and Human Services connection there and an operational interest. I think in this case, another interesting place would be the Armory, where so many people are lined up looking for the missing people, reporting people missing, scanning through the pictures, which would certainly add another human touch to this beyond the raw destruction at the site.
And my guess is he'll also want the president to be exposed to some of the volunteers, and by that I don't mean the fire department and the police, but the many, many New Yorkers who have volunteered just in every imaginable respect in the midst of this crisis.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think the other thing would be to the volunteers who worked the site and this job, but also some of those who are in limbo, wondering what happened to their loved ones, their friends.
The police commissioner did say this morning, by the way, the president couldn't be any safer than he is here in New York on this particular day. I want to invite in our resident historian, Michael Beschloss, because we have now, or we're in the process of now seeing, the president in two absolutely mandatory roles. First at the national presidential prayer service this morning at the National Capitol, talking to the nation. I think those are pretty close to the longest remarks the president has made, including the remarks he made on the night that he came back from Nebraska. And secondly now, Michael Beschloss going to the scene, because it's a must, is it not, for presidents to go to the scene, because they do offer, doesn't matter what party they are or what period they're, they offer a sense of connection that nobody else in the country can.
They do, and you know, Peter, presidents have these odd two roles. We're almost the only country where this is true, where a president is not only a political manager, which is a very divisive thing oftentimes, but also chief of state. And oftentimes presidents are no greater chiefs of state than they are, tragically, during a situation like this, when they seem something like a national father. Ronald Reagan, at the time of the Challenger disaster in 1986, it seemed that almost no one could fill that role better than he could. And Bill Clinton, after the tragedy in Oklahoma City in 1995, many people said that was the first time that they really began to imagine Clinton as president.
And in the media age, in the television age, where so much of the country participates in this, you judge the president on this level. I remember so well President Reagan comforting the families of the astronauts on Challenger in Houston at a memorial service. And the whole country was moved to tears, partly by the catastrophe, of course, but partly by the president's behavior. And when Bill Clinton not only went to see the survivors of the Oklahoma disaster, but talked, I recall at the time, talked to every single one of them. It took hours.
That's exactly right, and something that he does well. And that brings a president influence, because a president who really isn't seen in this chief of state role has a very hard time getting support for some of the policies that sometimes can be a little bit more divisive.
Now, you've heard us mention that in these snap polls, these sort of quick 600 or 700 person polls, which are, by the way, scientific, that we've taken, the president's approval rating is currently at about 91%. As you look back at presidents in crisis throughout at least modern American history, certainly since polling, how do they do, generally speaking, under these circumstances?
It always happens, and it even happens in situations that are unlike this, where the crisis is the president's fault. In the spring of 1961, John Kennedy, of course, presided over that disaster at the Bay of Pigs, that failed invasion of Cuba. In the aftermath, Americans rallied to him. His popularity shot up to the low 80s, and Kennedy said, you know, it's the strangest thing. The worse I do, the more popular I get.
And in some respects, this is the power that the additional power the president has as a result of modern media to communicate the message on his terms to the people.
That's exactly right. And you know, it really goes back, Peter, to the genius, I think, of our founders and those who wrote the Constitution, because they did this thing that was very controversial at the time, which is, rather than having a prime minister and a monarch, they decided to put those two things in one human being, as difficult as it is oftentimes for one human being to do both of those things. But I think one thing we're seeing today is what a good idea that was.
Now, I know that it's an individual choice, Michael, as to how one interprets what the president has to say on a public occasion like this. Some see it one way, some see it another. Your own opinions on what the president said at the National Cathedral today?
I think he was making a statement, not only in what he said, but also the fact that he was there and the kind of ceremony that was. That was a ceremony of defiance, because one of the things those terrorists were trying to do on Tuesday was make sure that we would never see a scene like that again. In the same way that after the Kennedy assassination, we have not seen presidents riding around in cities in open cars, tragically. The terrorists hoped that we would never have the courage to have as many key figures in the American government and American society in one place, because we would be afraid. In a way, that ceremony was a demonstration of the fact that the terrorists did not get what they were trying to do.
And every president, it seems to me, since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who finds himself in the midst of a crisis, always quotes Franklin Roosevelt. Mr. Roosevelt and his staff were brilliant praisemakers.
That's exactly right. And part of that was that even at a time like the Great Depression or the beginning of World War II, when there were all sorts of reasons to be very depressed and very pessimistic about what could happen, Roosevelt had that enormous self-confidence and confidence in history to say, yes, the situation looks bad, but we Americans have always been able to conquer things like this.
I want you to look, I don't know if you've got a transcript of the president's remarks at the cathedral yet, but if you do, I'd like you to check that particular phrase about the founders. I'm going to go to Claire Shipman in Washington for a moment and come back and see what you think of that. Claire, your reaction to the president at the cathedral today?
Well, and again, we always hate as journalists to give reactions, but I have to say, in all of the time I've spent watching him, I thought it was his most powerful speech ever, and I know that his aides were extremely happy with it. It's a very difficult moment for a president. It's a time when the entire nation is watching, and as you and Michael were talking about, he has to play a dual role, showing solace and compassion, healer in chief, if you will, if that hasn't become a cliche already, but also a great deal of strength and resolve. And I think for this president especially, somebody who often seems to shy away from the limelight, who's often happier letting others speak. He doesn't long for that spotlight. It's been an interesting transition to watch him over the last 3 days, and I think today he clearly hit his stride. I was most struck by the phrase of this will end in a way and the hour of our choosing. I mean, this was somebody who felt very comfortable with his words today. And again, it did remind me very much, although a moment I think 10 times more profound at the very least, but of President Clinton's trip to Oklahoma City when he was at a really low point in his presidency in 1995, and he was able to master that mix of strength and compassion. And again, I think I've already seen the poll numbers jump even before this speech for the president, and I can't imagine we're not going to see more of that in the aftermath.
Thanks, Claire, very much. Claire Shipman in Washington. Back now to Michael Beschloss. Michael, the phrase I'm referring to, and I'm not sure I've got it absolutely right, had to do basically with the commitment of the founders was the calling of our times. Interpret that for us if you can.
Well, I think the idea is that here we are 200 years later, and remarkably, we've been able to preserve the same system. From an agricultural country, here we are in a totally different world, highly technological, highly industrial, and nonetheless, that's the kind of thing that we're still following. I think the other thing that we have to remember with George W. Bush is that what really gave its power, the power to that speech for me was that this was not only a eulogy for those dead, this was a prelude to war, as you and George Stephanopoulos were talking about a little bit earlier. And you know what it reminded me of, Peter? It reminded me of the summer of 1940, or 41, when, as you remember, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, as we all know, met on that ship just off the Canadian coast.
Right.
And that was a meeting to prepare for a war in which America and Britain would be allies, and they sang, "Nearer, my God, to thee." People cried because they knew that war was coming.
To just continue that particular theme, at least one aspect of that theme, it was a real, not surprise today, but it was a very unusual event to see the American national anthem sung in the Canadian capital this morning in the front of the Canadian Parliament buildings. And I say that for two reasons, because, as I said originally, this is an extraordinary demonstration of solidarity between the two countries, but because Canada has so suffered in its relationship intellectually and psychologically with the United States down through the years and has always had a great deal of difficulty defining it. But there was no difficulty defining it whatsoever this morning.
I think that's right. And even to the minor fact that perhaps the criminals of the other day came over the Canadian border to the United States, it closes the circle with healing.
George Stephanopoulos, asking you once again to wear old hat. The president is always seen through one's own individual prism of political opinion. And there may still be people in the country who believe that this president came to office. What's the word I'm looking for? Not illegal.
But without the full, didn't get elected.
Illegitimately, didn't get elected. Came to the presidency in an illegitimate fashion. I think the country's getting by that in this instance.
Well, certainly in this instance. I mean, I think really what you're seeing here in the president's poll numbers that you quoted earlier is really a shattering of any kind of partisan identification, at least among average people in the country, regardless of what's happening in Washington. And I think that will happen for quite a long time. But, you know, and this often happens in war. You talk about President Bush's 41, his approval ratings during the Persian Gulf War, but also Michael Beschloss was just talking about Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill, coming out of World War II, also had tremendous popularity in the country, yet a year later
he was promptly defeated.
Yeah, so it's very short-lived.
It is one of the most astonishing things about modern British history, and people who did not live in Britain in those times have always had a difficult time understanding how this wartime leader could have been turned out of office.
Precisely the same thing happened to President Bush.
Precisely. One thing that President Bush, after the Gulf War, didn't have going for him was the economy, of course.
Exactly. Which is why, of course, you know, and it was in President Bush's statement the other night, in his statements of reassurance, one of the things he said, remember, was that the business of America will continue, and we will continue to move on. I was told, actually, that several major national business leaders lobbied the White House during the day to make sure that that kind of statement of reassurance was included because they were so worried about the economic impact.
In a moment, we're going to get it up to date as best we can about the status of air travel in the country by talking to Lisa Stark and our aviation analyst, John Nance. But first, you want to go to the streets to ABC's Bob Jamieson. Bob, from where you are, is there any sense of the president's impending arrival?
Peter, I think that what we have seen is a somewhat increased police presence, a few more gawkers. The National Guard, which is doing much of the traffic and pedestrian patrolling here, is a little bit more twitchy. But to say that there's a sense of anticipation, yes, but no visible sign. The real story down here, Peter, for the last several hours has been the weather. The rain that has fallen over the last dozen hours and the gusty wind which has accompanied it has slowed the rescue effort quite a bit, or should we say the search effort quite a bit. First of all, the search dogs have largely been unused today because the wind has made it difficult for them to pick up the scent. Normally rain would help, but there's been such a strong wind from time to time today that they have been used very, very sparingly. In addition to that, because of the slippery conditions caused by the rain, the people who have been moving this debris inches by inches sometimes in those bucket brigades have given way to simply and only equipment at some sectors of the search area. And in addition to that, the rain, which fell for such a long time, has made the debris much, much heavier. Meteorologist Bill Evans from New York's WABC TV has been using a mathematical formula today, and 1 1/4 inches of rain has fallen so far in the search area, ground zero. And he said that, according to this mathematical formula, would mean that the several 100,000 tons of debris has become about 50,000 tons heavier. Now, the rain is stopping, and it's entirely possible that when the president reaches the place where the Twin Towers used to stand, the sun could be poking through. But the weather is not going to improve that much in terms of the search. Steady winds of 15 to 20 miles an hour are expected from the north, with gusts up to 35 miles an hour, and so it's not going to get any easier down here.
Is there more heavy equipment arriving, or do they appear to have everything on scene that they need? And before you answer that question, that's the bucket brigade that we've been referring to. That's at a couple of locations, but that's that one particular central location where bucket brigades have worked relentlessly. There are really only two major areas at the moment, I think, where they are actually working in that very, very direct hand-by-hand way, because, as Bob Jamieson says, there's still an enormous amount of huge, heavy pieces of material to move, and it's difficult in a search and rescue site like this because it is also very noisy. Heavy equipment is noisy, and every so often, under earthquake circumstances, one wants to stop. There's a whistle, and everybody stops and listens if someone thinks they have heard something. Occasionally downtown, you will see a firefighter or some other searching official hold up his arms to indicate quiet, and they'll get quiet and they'll listen. But the overwhelming one of the overwhelming presences there on this site is, of course, noise. Anything else, Bob?
Well, you were asking about the equipment, and of course it's a balancing act, Peter, as you well know, between the very large cranes that can move these huge pieces of debris, particularly the steel beams, and smaller cranes which are able to do the more delicate work. There has been some additional heavy equipment arrive today, and in fact, I was told that the only piece of equipment of its kind, a new sort of destruction device or something used to bring down buildings, made by Caterpillar Tractor Company, a new product. The only one of its kind is in use here, but mostly what we have seen today is the steady movement of search and rescue people in and out of the site, and supplies being brought in.
Bob, on the subject of steady, this picture is not the result of a tired camera operator, though they have every reason to be tired. This is a very, very long lens looking at the facade of one of the buildings. And one of the senior officials in New York told us a short while ago when he was talking at length about the real estate operation here today. That's a live shot in downtown Manhattan. That's one of the U.S. fighter jets that has been on pretty constant patrol over the area since Tuesday. That's a regular appearance at the lower end of the city at the moment. It may well have been intensified today because the president is in New York, but that has now become a regular sight for people at the lower end of Manhattan today. At any rate, those pictures are showing the facades of buildings. In some respects, do not tell the complete story, and a senior official from the department, from the city, told us just a while ago that every building in the immediate area has now been checked, and every building that is now standing is in structurally sound condition, that there is no fear of collapse anymore, and that this, what he called cosmetic damage on the outside of buildings, that, by the way, is not cosmetic damage. This cosmetic damage on the outside of buildings was precisely that, and while many of them will be needing refurbishment and sometimes reconstruction inside, that all of these buildings have now been investigated by the engineers and are in pretty good shape. John Mueller.
This, of course, out of all the sites, is the one site where they have not yet recovered a black box, in fact, 2 black boxes. And they've expanded their search for it, not just through the rubble, but now as they truck the debris away, they've set up an area to take it in Staten Island, a landfill, where they empty the trucks by hand. And what they've been finding is amidst the debris, the large pieces, unfortunately, human remains, which is separated, given to the FBI evidence response team, and then sent to the medical examiner. But they're also told to do a hand search through every piece of debris, looking for any sign of the black boxes.
And that's why our pictures at this particular site are a little bit misleading, because we see these great pieces of equipment just claw large bits and pieces of material and debris off the ground, dump it in a truck and take it away. But as it goes over to Staten Island, to the west from Manhattan, it does go through this whole process like a sieve process, where it gets reduced and reduced and reduced. So whereas people talked earlier in the week about the unlikelihood or the likelihood of finding the black boxes in New York City, that process may in fact lead to them being found.
They're constantly surprising themselves. You know, they didn't think that they'd be able to recover the entire plane, 90% of it from Flight 800, from 200 feet underwater. And the same with each of the victims. In this case, I mean, this is almost unsurmountable, but they have an awful lot of people working on it.
Okay, John Mueller, thanks very much. We are, of course, waiting to see the president here in New York. He is here, and we will have a visual hookup with him in just a moment. Thank you. Yes, indeed, the 37-member congressional delegation came to New York. That's the 37-member New York congressional delegation, which came here with the president, flying in one of the giant helicopters. So that's at least how we know he got to where he is going from where he landed, but we do not know where he landed as of yet. And on board with the president today from Washington were the 2 New York senators, Senator Clinton and Senator Schumer. By the way, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or let's figure out exactly where he's landing. We're all searching the skyline, and well, there are a couple of helicopters coming in now. And this is perhaps what the White House spokesman Ari Fleischer meant when he said that the beast, as it's sometimes referred to, and by that we mean the presidential entourage, not to mention the press corps, is going to be still a beast, but a smaller beast today. And as the Marine Corps brings in this delegation, which will include the press, we're trying to figure out exactly where he lands. If we could ask our director to maybe go back the next time to that helicopter landing and see if we can pick up the background here. I, for some reason, think that the president has landed on the eastern side of Lower Manhattan, but I am not absolutely sure, unless those buildings on the back are over there in the direction of Ellis Island. Is that the Ellis Island? Is that Ellis? I think that may be the Ellis Island Museum and Foundation on the other side, but it's very hard to tell from this particular perspective, so why should we guess? He'll be on the ground soon enough. At any rate, here's an interesting other dimension of the search. We've talked a lot during the week about the importance of cell phones. The Federal Emergency Management Agency says it now intends to collect, and may have done a considerable amount of this already, the cell phone numbers of everybody who is missing. And every cell phone in the nation, every cell phone company in the nation has agreed to pulse the numbers, to keep ringing the numbers in the hope that someone will answer. You recall that from underneath the rubble, we have already heard of people using their cell phones to try to call out. And at the very least, this may be another contributing factor to knowing where people are, whether, quite frankly, they have survived or not.
It's interesting, when this started, several people that I know are among the unaccounted for, and as we were sitting here that day watching this unfold, during breaks I would call the cell phones, and the cell phones would be ringing and go to voicemail. And by the second day, myself and other people who were calling were getting the cell phones of people unaccounted for saying mailbox full, which was strange and eerie. I mean, you'd hear somebody you know to be missing come on with their voice message, and then it would stop and someone would say the mailbox is full. So you know that so many people were trying to call into them because they were worried.
Here's one more aspect of the operation, and this is one more surprise to us, because you may recall earlier that the Federal Emergency Management Administration Agency said that everything was under control. The city had as much as it needed. The federal government was providing as much as the volunteers and the other rescue workers needed. But the Red Cross here in New York City, quite the contrary. The Red Cross says the city is, and these workers are in desperate need. And here's the quote: desperately needs the following supplies: work boots, work gloves, men's sweatpants and sweatshirts, socks, men's underwear, eye drops, hard hats, goggles, masks, and individually packaged food and drinks such as energy bars. So there is something of a conflict here, and not an unimportant conflict, about whether or not the people who are doing all the work there on the ground have all of the resources they need. It may well be that the fire department or the police department have all the resources they need. We met some firemen who'd driven in from Cincinnati in the middle of the night. They said they were immediately absorbed by one of the firehouses here in New York City, given a place to sleep, given all the stuff that they needed. But the Red Cross says that in more general teams, they have real needs. There is Senator Lieberman from Connecticut and Senator Clinton, a couple of the congressmen in this delegation who have landed with the president. And in many cases, there's Senator Schumer just crossing in front of the camera there. They've all got, you notice they've got FEMA jackets on, Federal Emergency Management Agency jackets, which is a very good, and one could argue appropriate, advertisement for this particular federal agency. But there are still needs in New York City, according to the Red Cross, which have not been filled. Work boots, work gloves, men's sweatpants and sweatshirts, socks, men's underwear, eye drops, hard hats, goggles, masks, and individually packaged food and drinks such as energy bars. So here they are. They are in New York City, and there are several helicopters. It may well be that this is the president circling in the air, but I would be surprised if the president were circling under any circumstances. And George Stephanopoulos, who knows, concurs immediately. The president will come in. He will come in directly, and he will come in fast. And this is certainly a more familiar presidential helicopter. This looks a lot more like Marine One, which we see shuttling back and forth between the White House to Andrews Air Force Base, and having the president come in on a larger helicopter with a large number of people. I think if it's okay with you, we'll just stay with those pictures down below. Is that okay with you? Thank you very much, Director. Thank you very much. Well, it gives us a sense of where we were. Maybe, I wonder if you could ask the cameraman who's taking this live picture. Oh, I see, it's a pool camera. But if we have any connection with the pool cameras, it would be nice to see. This may well be the Wall Street heliport at the lower end of Wall Street, where everybody has landed. There are not an enormous number of landing facilities at the southern end of Manhattan, so this may well be the Wall Street heliport right at the foot of Wall Street. There is access on both the Hudson River side and the East River side to heliports, but this is what it may be. And I'm not quite sure why I'm so consumed with the notion of exactly where it is at the moment anyway. At any rate, another measure of how much has changed in these few short days New York was not a particularly politically hospitable state for President Bush before all this. He was not particularly popular among his congressional delegation, which is dominated by Democrats, but he arrives now in New York as a very popular national leader and very welcomed by a city looking for moral, psychological, and financial help from him. And those same Democrats, as we heard from, certainly from Senator Clinton, in an interview here last night, the Democrats are filled with praise from him and very, very supportive, as is the country. ABC's Lisa Stark on aviation news. Lisa.
Well, Peter, I want to bring you some news we are just getting from the crash scene outside Pittsburgh. It was United Airlines Flight 93 that went down there, and it has been somewhat of a mystery about what brought the plane down in that location. Obviously, given what happened in the other 3 locations, we would assume that this plane, too, was heading toward a target. Well, Pennsylvania Senators Arlen Specter and Rick Santorum have now held a news conference at that location and have indicated that they have been privy to these cell phone conversations that were going on from passengers calling off that doomed jetliner. What they say is it now does appear that the passengers did try to overtake the hijackers on that airplane, and that is in fact what brought the jet down. That is according to the 2 senators. They also say that they have every reason apparently to believe that the plane may have been heading to the Capitol building, but was diverted by, as they call it, these heroic passengers. And they also say they will pursue freedom medals for the passengers. But again, the 2 Pennsylvania senators indicating they have seen, at least seen transcripts of these cell phone conversations indicating that passengers did apparently try to storm the cockpit, try to stop the hijacking, and that is apparently what brought down United Flight 93.
Thanks very much, Lisa. That's very useful information. There have been rumors around to that effect. There have been reports to that effect in one cell phone message of one of the passengers on board to his family, what turned out to be a final conversation between Am and his family. That was very much the import of the message that we got from the family subsequently, and we will immediately put in a request for Senators Specter and Santorum to come and tell us what they have heard. But in Lisa's summary there, the cell phone story from the United flight which crashed in rural Pennsylvania does tell a story, according to the 2 senators, of an attempted taking over of the hijackers by the passengers on board, which led to it being brought down. They did try to breach the cockpit and get a hold or control of the aircraft. And there is some reason to believe, those senators say, that the plane was headed for the U.S. Capitol. That may in time answer some very, very, very important questions that we have been unable to answer for the last several days, given this was the one of the 4 aircraft which ended up nowhere near its apparently hijacker terrorist intended target. So the president is on the ground on New York City territory, and now he gets a chance to see for himself what he's only seen on television, and which a limited number of people have seen in person. I was just asking my colleague, Jog Miller, who is clearly unable to read my writing.
Never have been.
Whether or not we're pretty certain now this is the Wall Street heliport.
Yes.
Okay.
They've widened out. I've seen the landmarks. That's
Good,
where he is.
good. That's what I thought.
And that's a very common landing place for the presidential helicopter in New York.
And for businessmen coming and going from Wall Street, very often to their pleasure palaces, as it is sometimes said, further out along the beaches that extend all the way from New York City out to the end of Long Island to the east. Go ahead, George, please.
It's just that's Ari Fleischer, the presidential press secretary. He's just gotten off one of the helicopters and walking this way.
Always with a phone in his ear. Talking to somebody about some challenge, about some question. Mr. Fleischer has had more public airtime. That is
Karen Hughes.
I'm just wondering if it really was Karen. I wanted to wait for her to get a little closer. Karen Hughes, one of the president's principal advisors. And where goes the president? Almost invariably goes, that was indeed Karen Hughes, who's come with the president. And where goes the president? So goes Karen Hughes and Karl Rove, his principal political advisor, who I bet you is right there behind that vehicle. And up until the president actually went to the White House, you could almost always see Joe Albaugh with the president on the campaign trail, certainly. And it is Joe Albaugh who is now the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. He's the guy who's been given a hard time a few minutes ago because there do appear to be shortages in New York. So here comes the press corps. I think probably everybody in the audience knows the president travels with what is called a tight pool. A camera team that represents the television networks and the cable channels, and we all get the video for the most part distributed to us at the same time. A transmission point will have been established before the president is here, and then the national magazines and the newspapers and the wire services all have some kind of representation. And the more media there is in the world, and there is so much now, the more representation is needed in the tight White House pool. Not an aircraft, we realize, but the president is just about to get off his helicopter, so perhaps we should we hang down there. Claire Shipman, you've been in lots of these visits, not this context, but I mean lots of presidential visits.
Oh, absolutely, and this one is obviously going to be quite different from any other presidential visit. As we were talking about yesterday, they're clearly trying to make it a relatively small operation, although, again, it turned out to be a fairly large congressional delegation that he was bringing with him. And it's awfully hard, frankly, to limit the size of the delegation, and the Secret Service and everybody with him when he travels. But the teams of people who put these things together are extraordinary, and they can really do it at a moment's notice, and they've certainly been working on it for the last 48 hours. I think this is also a continuation, as we were talking about earlier, Peter, of this dual role for the president as somebody who people can turn to as a national healer. And he has been very eager to get out and see the victims, the families of the victims, and the damage itself. But they've been looking hard to find a way to do it that just would not disrupt things too much in the city.
It's interesting, Claire. We get so focused on what we think is happening at the moment that we sometimes get caught very much off guard. George has just pointed out to me that we're looking at this helicopter, which has brought in the congressional delegation of the press corps, and the president got out of an SUV. And if we think about it for only 2 seconds, he's already been to see Mayor Giuliani. This is not exactly where he's going to meet the mayor. They've already had a conversation, to the best of my knowledge, and now the president's about to make his public appearance at the World Trade Center. So he's been here. He landed somewhere else.
Now it is possible that he could have landed the helicopter at Gracie Mansion and helicoptered over, but they've taken such precautions with security, Peter, in these last few days. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they did a lot of these decoys deliberately.
Mm-hmm.
Because the last helicopter which landed was the exact representation of, as I said, a Marine One, which the president uses all the time to go back and forth between the White House and Andrews.
It is interesting that this SUV, as opposed to the usual Secret Service SUVs, has the presidential seal on the door, just as the presidential limo does, which is kind of a new touch.
Well, that will have been
seems to be the presidential SUV.
Well, there may be one available here in New York City all the time, or it may well have been brought up in advance. But there we are.
Ironically, the Secret Service offices were at the World Trade Center, and at the time of the first World Trade Center bombing, the presidential New York fleet is kept there and was damaged. So they moved it out.
There's a speaker open around here. I just might want to mention to somebody because we're getting a fairly negative reaction in terms of the sound. Michael Beschloss in Washington, please join us anytime you feel like it, including pointing out that you knew precisely that we were going to be fooled by all this, right?
Of course, in a situation like this, I think the security is so careful that probably the best thing they can do is to fool us. But I hate to keep on bringing it back to history, but it reminds you a little bit of the King and the Queen and the Blitz in London in the fall of 1940. They made a very big point of showing that they would walk among the rubble, talk to those that had been hurt, and also against a lot of advice, they stayed in London under the rain of bombs. Many of their security people said you should go out into the country. They felt that one of the biggest weapons that England had was morale, and that would be stiffened by their staying in London.
And there is no doubt that the president will be good for New York City's morale today, as he has clearly been for the country at this national prayer service at the National Cathedral. If you watched it with us a while ago, we cannot tell you. We're all sitting here looking at the pictures precisely as you are. We're not quite sure how the president will approach the site. We're not certain how close he will get to the site. We do know that there will obviously be some concern about his physical safety, and by this I mean in terms of the surrounding buildings. But as New York City officials have told us, all the surrounding buildings are structurally sound. There does not seem to be any particular reason why the president could not approach the actual hole itself, where a lot of that hand digging is going on. But he is now going up one of the exit ramps, entrance exit ramps from, somebody help me read the sign down below. I think it's the one that indicated to the helipad.
He's going up the northbound
of the East River Drive
portion of the East River Drive towards the Brooklyn Bridge. Interestingly, the trip to the World Trade Center would have been much shorter going the other way.
By which you mean?
Coming out of the Wall Street heliport, making a left, looping around the Battery, and you would be right there on West Street. So,
well, our assumption, of course, that he's going to the World Trade Center right away. Another assumption about which we may be wrong. But the point is, the point is very simply, the president is here to raise morale. The president is here to see in person for himself. The president is here to get personal, visible reaffirmation for himself that these commitments to New York City, that the city will get from the federal government everything it needs, is exactly why the president is here. And it may well be the president is here to see the families of people who have either died or who've suffered. That is unquestionably a part of his visit here. I cannot imagine that he would come and go from the city without doing that which every president would want to do. But the enormous security involved in this ordinarily simple trip is a reminder that he was actually scheduled to be in this city a week on Monday for the opening session of the annual meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations, which even under normal circumstances is a giant security hassle for the United Nations, for the federal government, because the president is here, and for the city. Now, there has been a request made to the General Assembly to consider and perhaps postpone this annual meeting of the General Assembly unless the conditions here improve at this lower end of Manhattan, improve dramatically between now and then. It's going to be very, very difficult for the United Nations. The United Nations was one of the first places evacuated, and it may be, George, it may be that the annual meeting, which is so important to leaders from around the world, will be never canceled, but delayed or postponed.
Indefinitely.
What do you think?
Well, it may be. You know, we do have some information. Later this month, there were supposed to be the meetings of the IMF and the World Bank in Washington. Right. Now we have indications that those are all but certain to be canceled.
But they haven't been canceled.
Not yet.
They were shortened originally. They haven't been canceled yet.
We've had some information this morning that the officials involved have made the recommendations. So far, the only agency that's balking is the United States Treasury Department, but there are a lot of indications that decision will be made before the end of the weekend. As you point out,
what do you mean the Treasury Department is balking at what? Canceling the World Trade meeting?
Or at least announcing it right away.
Meeting?
Yes, canceling the World Bank and IMF meetings. As far as the UN General Assembly goes, as you well point out, even in the best of times, that meeting completely locks up Manhattan, the entire East Side, and all throughout Midtown. But now with all of downtown Manhattan blocked out as well, just even if you took away all the diplomatic reasons to go forward. Just logistically, it would seem to be impossible.
I understand that, but I have to tell you, again, it's just one man's opinion. I think that it's important, and this is just my opinion, it is important for the World Bank meeting and the International Monetary Fund meeting to go forward, and I think it's important to this to go forward because everything that does not go forward says to the terrorists who have committed this act or who revel in the commitment of this act, hey, look what we accomplished.
Although I think there's no question you're right about that. Remember, there were already going to be problems with the World Bank and the IMF because of this spate of anti-globalization protests we've seen at every meeting of the World Bank and the IMF.
And I think it's very,
years.
I agree with you, and I think it's very difficult to decide on where they're going to be held. The next meeting of the G8, the industrial nations, is going to be held in Canada, and the Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien decided it was going to be held in Alberta. It's actually going to be held in the same place they had the ski jumping and some of the cross-country for the Winter Olympics. What year were they? 1988 in Canada, in Calgary. They're going to be in the middle of nowhere.
Not a lot of cross streets.
They're going to be in the middle of nowhere. And this is how dissatisfied people in the world, many of whom are legitimately dissatisfied. I'm talking now about large numbers of governmental organizations who want to have their public presence felt at these World Industrial Meetings, have been forced into a situation where they're not going to be able to by those people who come just purely to cause disruption.
Which only reinforces the arguments of many of the protesters who say that these organizations are too closed.
Absolutely, but I was thinking purely in logistical and security terms at the moment, so I think you may be closer to being right on the whole question of the United Nations General Assembly meeting. I wonder, Ms. Gabriner, if we could invest in a call to the Secretary General's office while we are here by somebody and simply ask whether any decision has been made or whether it is being considered. The White House, by the way, has just issued a statement. If we can come back, we can't come back down to that flag for just a second, but extending the proclamation for all flags to be flown at half-staff by one additional week. White House asking all Americans and ordering federal, state facilities to keep their flags at half-staff through Saturday, September the 22nd, rather than following the original White House proclamation asking them for it to be flown at half-staff through Sunday, September the 16th, would be this Sunday. So the White House is asking for another week. And I'm not even sure the White House would have needed to ask for the flags, at least on non-official structures.